It's about history. It's about preservation. It's about sense of place here on Eastern Long Island. With Esperanza Leon, I'm Erwin Levy, and this is Our Hamptons. Esperanza, good morning.
Hello, Erwin.
You know, Esperanza, before I introduce our incredibly special guest today, I have to say, back in the day when this podcast was in its very infancy, and this we're talking well before, we moved into our state-of-the-art studio with all of this high-end equipment. This individual was actually the subject of podcast number 1, way back in May of 2022.
Yes, indeed, our inaugural episode, and central to it, in fact.
And it was very central to it because it was really, and what we're going to discuss with him was essentially what we're going to discuss with him today was the gist of that initial conversation, which was about Poseyville, that particular section of Amagansett. But anyway, without further ado, I'm going to introduce, and Esperanza, this is for Our Hamptons podcast. Let me introduce the writer, best known, I guess, for his work in the New York Times, but also, the New Yorker, Vanity Fair. He's written a few books, ballpark, baseball, about baseball in the American city. But really, without further ado, the Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, Mr. Paul Goldberger. Paul, welcome to Our Hamptons podcast.
Thank you, Erwin and Esperanza. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and
thank you for being here.
What we're really going to talk about.
Taken me a long time to earn my spot on your podcast, so I'm very.
Oh, that's so kind.
Oh my gosh, boy!
I doubt it. We're quoting you all the time.
He really is. We do quote Paul Goldberger all the time on our Hamptons podcast, Esperanza. But boy,
let's say, in other words, you've been here sort of spiritually for a lot of episodes.
That's nice to hear.
No question. And Esperanza, he actually did an excellent job of stroking my incredibly fragile male ego. So thank you for that, Paul. We do appreciate it. But, what we're really going to discuss, and again, it was the subject really, Esperanza, of literally podcast number 1 of Our Hamptons podcast, which was the extraordinary New York Times cover story, magazine section of 1983, Labor Day weekend, 1983, the strangling of a resort. So I guess this is sort of like a 42-year retrospective. And Esperanza, I know you weren't there, but I was at the Jewish Center of the Hamptons talk on modernism in the Hamptons today. And I actually asked Paul about that article. And this is really, it was such a transformative article, Paul.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Erwin.
Discussing this. And so really, starting right off with that, take us back to Labor Day 1983. We're curious how this whole article really came about. Were you spending the summers here? You sort of, again, you were younger at the time, obviously.
I was definitely younger at the time. Yes.
Right.
A young writer and critic at the New York Times. I had been spending summers here. I didn't at that point own a house, but my wife and I had been renting houses and had a number of friends here and had come to know this area moderately well, at least. And I was increasingly aware of the fact that development was accelerating and traffic was getting worse. Everything seemed somehow more stressed than it used to be. And now, in my case, the stage was set for that a few years before that, when I had started my first job at the New York Times, before I became architecture critic. I remember I had a colleague, an older colleague, who with his wife had come here a lot. At that point, I'm not sure I'd even been to the Hamptons. And he was telling me how he used to rent houses here, and he and his wife felt they were ready to sort of buy something, and they came out and spent some time with a real estate agent. And I remember his telling me on Monday morning that it was a terrible weekend. Things had gotten so out of control there that they saw a whole lot of things, but they could not find a decent house to buy for under $50,000, which was their budget. We're talking about buy, not rent here.
Right. Oh.
Right.
And uh, and so that was probably, I don't know, 9 years maybe before this article, something like that. And then a few years later, I began to come here myself. Uh, my wife and I rented something, then another house, and I became sort of somewhat more involved in the community. And we had a lot of friends here, and it was increasingly clear that uh, something was happening that was different from either the old resort, the old summer colony of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, or those early modern houses that began to pop up a lot in the 50s and 60s that were kind of modest and mostly understated, almost like little pavilions within houses.
Yeah.
And they represented a very casual attitude toward the place. And they were built often in farmland, but with the kind of presumption that most of the farmland would stay and that this one little house could have a view of many acres. And it was becoming increasingly clear that that was a fallacy. That was not, things were not working out that way, because where you could build one little house at the corner of a piece of farmland, you could then build many more and ultimately chop up the farmland completely.
Well, this is,
We were in the process of seeing that transition in the early 80s.
yeah. And, you wrote in the article, and I really love this quote. It's something I've paraphrased myself over the years, how though the crowds that swarm the beaches in midsummer may not see it, the Hamptons or the country as much as the seashore. And I've always felt that, being here since 1989 in a variety of different ways, for me, it would morph from a resort to the country, particularly as we
Yes,
get
absolutely.
into off season, right?
Well, I remember, and not even off season, I remember my very first visit here in the 70s. I should say that I grew up spending my summers on the Jersey Shore on Long Beach Island, which was a very nice place, and I have very happy memories of being a kid at the beach. But it's really kind of a sandbar. It's more like Fire Island, but with cars.
Right.
Um, and the one thing it never had was trees, and it didn't even have much grass. And the idea that you could have a place that had a beach, an ocean, but also real landscape, trees and rolling lawns and gardens and woods and all these other things. I had literally never seen anything like that when I came here.
Yeah.
So that line in the piece was really my channeling my memory of a few years before when I first came here, and thinking that, and how amazing it was, actually.
I've always felt like driving east from Amagansett, from what we'll call the lanes into East Hampton, from forest to dunescape in seconds. And
That's right. From forest to dunescape in seconds. But then you can go in another direction and go to marshes and then even hills and cliffs. And I mean, the number of different types of landscape that are within a very tight geographical area here. I mean, think of the glacial moraine.
Yes.
And still in some cases, although fewer and fewer of them, farmland that just goes down almost to the ocean. And all of that stuff is really absolutely remarkable, especially when you consider that it's 100 miles from New York City.
Right.
For all the frustrations that we all feel about overdevelopment and all the issues that we face here, there are other times when I think how amazing that there are not boardwalks and high-rise condos along the beach here, actually. I mean, there are times when I do feel we do have to say the glass is half full, not half empty.
Yeah. Esperanza,
we focus on that a lot.
Right. Esperanza, it's reminiscent when we spoke about things like Mid-Hamptons, where the Depression stopped those developers in Wainscott from putting a casino on Georgia Pond, or
Yes,
Carl Fisher being stopped from the Miami Beach, then turning Montauk into
exactly,
Miami Beach. So
exactly. Well, poverty is a great friend to preservation.
Yeah.
I,
So is wealth.
wow.
Right, yeah, but well, sometimes, yes, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But
Because if we
yeah,
look at it in another way, sometimes when land is concentrated in the hands of few, as in the wealthy, then it tends to get preserved because it doesn't get developed into
well,
smaller.
that is true, and you know, concerning though a lot of the enormous houses are here, it's often much better for the future of the land to have one house on several acres than several houses each on a half acre.
Correct.
The
Yeah.
problem we're facing now is we're having the worst of both worlds
Yeah.
because we
Yes.
are seeing tiny lots that are getting enormous houses on them.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
And that's truly the worst of both worlds. Uh,
Right.
Erwin, you mentioned Poseyville
Well, that's, yeah, I was just thinking
earlier,
that
and
using your terminology,
right,
which is
right.
they shoehorned in that area
Yes,
on Handy Lane. They
Handy
just
Lane
shoehorned those large houses.
represents, it's the epitome of what we should not be doing.
yeah.
Yes.
It is, it is, very large houses, each with pool, a pool house, a garage, but on lots that are so tight that in most cases, these houses, the garages face the street
Right.
because the lots don't even allow enough room for a driveway to circle around and come in from the side.
Mhm.
It's too
Mhm.
close. So
Yeah.
you couldn't make the turn. So,
Uh,
I mean, this is not good planning. Those are old lots that were divided up back in the days when that was a fisherman's village, basically,
Right.
and there were
Right.
small cottages there. They were
e-
never conceived of as having six-bedroom
exactly.
summer houses.
Mansions, basically, mini
Yeah,
mansions.
mini
Yeah.
mansions, squeezed onto these tiny lots.
No, we do prefer the real Paul Goldberger term of shoehorned.
Right.
We have mentioned that line. You have been a huge part of this podcast, Paul,
I'm
because you have
honored. Thank you.
we
Thank
have
you.
really brought that up. But and it really gets into the whole, thinking back of this article, because I guess Esperanza, for me, what's so striking about this article is unfortunately how accurate Paul was on so much of what he said here. And I have to ask, it wasn't just the physical assault on the land that we're referring to, but the mindset. In terms of the more things change, the more they stay the same. Esperanza
Yep.
and I on our Hamptons podcast often quote William Pickens Jr. of Sag Harbor Hills, the late William
Mhm.
Pickens, who said one of the most profound statements, who put it so succinctly: "Are we a community or a commodity?" And that's really, for me, in terms of what's been happening here, Paul, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's played into, really, dare I say, the reason for the physical assault on the land. Just
The
the change in
commodification.
mindset. Yeah.
Right. I agree completely. And all too often we are a commodity more than a community. Although I do not believe things have gotten so bad that we are a commodity instead of being a community. I think we are both, and they often struggle. They're really kind of at odds with each other and struggling with each other. But it's also true. Look, real estate has always been a commodity. When the Manhattan grid was created in 1811, that was done in part to allow the easy division of land into saleable lots, which you could say was in many ways a beginning of the commodification of real estate. So it's not as though the world has been nothing but perfect, idyllic community until developers began to build in the Hamptons, and suddenly, for the first time in history, it became a commodity. However, in the constant dynamic and tension between community and commodity, commodity's been pushing awfully hard on its side lately. I put it
Yeah.
that way. And therefore, but there are also some very encouraging signs that the community side is pushing back too. the panel at the Jewish Center of the Hamptons a little while ago that Erwin mentioned earlier also featured Jane Mering, who has been doing, wonderful work with her organization Build in Kind, East Hampton, pushing back against a lot of the planning errors that have brought us to where we are now, and also, arguing for reduction in house size and a lot of other things like that's been very effective. And she's doing really
Yeah.
fantastic work, and now is helping to establish a community uh, trust,
Housing trust,
Yeah.
yeah.
housing trust to permit more affordable housing here.
She's
Where yeah, she's a really a great gift. I mean, she represents community at its best, I would say.
Jane's a dear friend of both Esperanza and I, and
Right, right.
I always refer to Jane affectionately as a force of nature because that's really what she is. She's
She is a force of
a one
nature.
woman wrecking crew in a good way, if you
Mhm.
Yes,
will,
yes,
right?
yes, yes. Well,
But
one woman wrecking crew to what is bad, but also a one woman salvation crew of
yes,
community in many ways. I mean, she's really doing work that is, and the fact that she has not only extraordinary energy and drive to do this, but also remarkable knowledge and patience to delve into the details. Because, of course, zoning law and planning law is so full of technicalities. It's like tax law. And if in very often people pushing for the wrong things count on the fact that people on the other side are either too bored with it or don't understand it
Or
and
too
give up,
busy.
or too busy, exactly. And so Jane is like the secret weapon of,
yeah,
of the other side, that she is really has the patience and the knowledge to analyze all this stuff, tell everyone else what it means and what the impact will be.
yeah.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's, I mean, every community, if she could be cloned, it would be
Well, if
wonderful.
she could be cloned, we wouldn't be
Well,
in this predicament
well, and
necessarily.
I
Right.
and I would say, and speaking, because I have had such a relationship with her, to I'm thinking about if more people, in the sense, like Jane and I chat about geeking out on the code, if more people actually read the code of
Yeah.
East Hampton and understood what goes into it, what is behind it, there are so many good parts of it that are
Yes.
completely obliterated by people's the mindset that Erwin, I think, was referring to before, that we can do whatever we want,
Right.
and then it's steamrolled. It's completely
Right.
steamrolled.
Right. Now, the entitlement of a lot of the great wealth here is a serious part of the problem. Absolutely. Although,
And
yeah.
Paul,
Mhm.
that's what's so extraordinary because you're talking about that now, and it's something you spoke of, 42 years ago in this
Yeah, it's
article,
incredible because reading
specifically.
that article from 1983 feels like it was 2023.
You
It's
know,
easily.
completely true. And, and I want to get back to that in a second, but I do want
Sure.
to ask
Sure.
you just so we can, reference the article sort of from a then and now perspective. All right, we understand the early 80s, 1983, when you wrote this. There wasn't a 24-hour news cycle like there is. There was no
That's
social
correct.
media.
No, that's
We
right.
didn't have these things, but
No cell phones, no
no
mobile.
cell phones.
No, no. One of the great, uh, most exciting moments for me of that article was uh, being on the beach on that Sunday of Labor Day weekend when it appeared, and looking around, and there were like, all these different people lying in their beach chairs reading the article. And so
Yeah,
that was a kind of an amazing thing to behold. Um, but you're right. What else did people have to do in those days but read the New York
it
Times?
was so different. But like, so I do have to ask the question, like, uh, look, we always know how high a profile Eastern Long Island has had, but when
Hmm.
you were here, you mentioned in the article, and it was the mid 60s when really was the influx of the Californians, the Europeans, the South Americans started arriving, people of means from other parts of the country and the world for that matter.
Hmm.
What was the profile? Like how bright was the glare of the spotlight on Eastern Long Island then as opposed to now?
Um, it was not nearly as bright as it is now. Um, we were also at a time when, even though the pressures were beginning to grow and development was, as we've said, becoming a bigger and bigger issue, and the loss of land, we were, it was before the financialization of almost everything in the world, I mean, and so everything was not presented in terms of money, fame, spotlight, celebrity in quite the way it is now. I mean, you know, publications like Hampton's Magazine and the idea that people would have product launches and have things, and that every event would be some sort of corporate sponsorship and things like that. You didn't see so much of that then. I mean, maybe the very beginnings of it were there, but not much really. It
You
was
know,
still, and certainly compared to today, it was indeed very quiet. I don't want to pretend that it was a completely idyllic past. That's a little too easy and glib. Things were, as I said earlier, already getting more expensive. They were definitely getting more crowded, or I wouldn't have written that article. Uh,
Right.
but uh, there was a sense somehow that it was at least somewhat more of an escape than it had been, or than it is now. But of course, nothing is an escape now in quite the way it once was. I mean,
Around the world, right?
around the world,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, you are instantly in communication wherever you are now. I remember when I first started going to Europe as a college student and then as a young adult, you would write letters to make reservations in hotels and restaurants, and they would write back to you, and it took a couple of weeks, and I don't know what you did if you had to change something because it really was almost impossible.
Hmm.
Paul, it,
And
it reminds me of a podcast Esperanza and I did. Esperanza, you'll recall when we spoke of how when Arthur Miller and Marilyn Monroe came out here,
yes,
they were
yes,
hiding from the
right.
public, and Paul, like Paul's mentioning now, the celebrities are coming so they could post on their Instagram that where they are and what they're doing. It's
Yeah,
just
it's a very different place. And my mother, we've talked about this so often, and it's what you're saying, Erwin. It's people came here, to your point, Paul, that to escape, to hide, to
Yes.
retreat, not to be seen. The celebrities would walk down the street, and the reason why they were coming here is because they weren't going to be, uh, attacked by paparazzi.
right.
So that wasn't a thing. Now it's just the opposite. And it's interesting you brought up Hampton's magazine, but I remember the rise of Hampton's magazine. I mean, it started in the late 70s, but it became, I remember my brother and I would collect those covers, and Madonna was on the cover. Like that
Mhm.
was the beginning of that celebrity status of this place that I guess coincides, if I think about it, with this rise of Wall Street in as such a focus of everyone's life. Like your portfolio was your life.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm. That's right. But you're right. I mean, that's why you're right, reminding us that Hampton's magazine, say, began in the late 70s, because that's, I think, exactly the point. The article was at a point where all of the signs were there and they were mounting, but
Hmm.
things had not reached quite the state that they are today.
Yeah, yeah.
Remember, we also uh, everyone thought briefly and clearly very wrongly that stopping the Sunrise Highway, which was originally going to go not stop in Southampton, but go all the way to through Amagansett to join into the road to Montauk, would discourage development. That the bottleneck would mean not that many people could get through, and not that many people would come. That turned out to be the greatest misconception of all, because to do that without doing it as part of a comprehensive planning strategy was a terrible mistake, because people just came anyway. We believed sort of in the reverse of the old line from Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come.
Right.
People thought of the highway, well, if we don't build it, they will not come.
Right.
But they came anyway. And
Right. Or we could say that had the highway been built, that bypass that there would still be just congestion in both places
well,
because
that's right. That's right.
that's
Because
just
in
what would
fact,
have happened. So,
historically, highways have actually created more demand, not they've rarely merely satisfied existing demand.
right.
I mean, there's a phrase planners use called induced demand, that highways induce further demand. So, I'm by saying that it was wrong, I'm hardly saying we therefore should have built the highway.
Right.
But no, I mean, from a purely ecological standpoint, it's better that we did not. But we
From an
solved
environmental
the problem.
and
Right, right,
sanity standpoint.
right.
And at that time, and this is something you touched on in the article. Uh, Early on in all of this development, this place was still primarily an agricultural community. So,
Yes.
in a
Yeah.
sense, the local homeowners, the local population was sort of welcoming the influx early on. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean,
Yes,
because
I
it
think I
was,
think I think they were. There were um, local people who were benefiting in many ways from it. They were, I mean, farmers who had substantial land holdings could sell off a few acres and make some money while continuing to farm. Fishermen were continuing to fish. And most importantly, uh, they all had places to live. So you could grow up in the community. Uh, you may not have been wealthy, but you could afford a place to live and a position in the community. And that became harder and harder and harder as prices kept rising and rising, and small houses in parts of the community like Poseyville, which you mentioned earlier, that really had been not at all summer people or city people. They had been entirely areas of locals, uh, began to change significantly and gentrify, become much more expensive. And the locals were not only finding that it was harder and harder for them to afford to remain, the next generation, kids who grew up here in local families and reached adulthood and wanted to buy houses of their own, found that they were priced out of the very community in which they'd grown up.
you know, and Paul, during in the article, I mean, which was striking to me when I read, you're talking about predominantly things that were happening at the village centers. You
Yeah,
mentioned
yeah. Hmm.
the wrong side of the tracks in East Hampton Village. You'd be hard pressed during the writing of this article to find a house under $100,000. I mean,
Yes,
we're
yes.
talking, I guess, Sherrill Road, Cooper Lane, those,
Yes,
Palmer Terrace, those
Osborne,
streets what you're
those
referring
those
to.
those in East Hampton Village, absolutely.
Exactly.
Those are now, very, I mean, those are all, $1 million and up houses.
Untouchable, basically. But and
Yes.
this is where, and I know you were asking these questions, and you touched on it again. This is where the foresight of this story comes in for me so strong, Esperanza. Some of these quotes in this article, and it really asks the question: is it possible for a community to determine its destiny at all? Is the best future for any community, rural or urban, the one that occurs naturally when the free market is allowed to prevail? These are profound statements that are 42 years later still difficult to answer,
Well,
right,
and
Paul? I
well,
mean,
and they're not statements that there's a simple answer to either, actually. I mean, we're seeing all of these forces continue. I've always been fascinated at both the local level of small communities and the mega level of large cities in the relationship between sort of natural forces and human intervention. And I strongly believe that natural growth uh, while it would appear to have a certain kind of organic and therefore kind of healthy natural quality, isn't always healthy in and of itself. And it needs to be managed. And what planning and zoning and all those things are management tools. I mean, in the same way that, if you have a garden, um, your garden is a very natural thing. But if you don't tend it, it will soon be chaos.
Yes.
And uh, and that's true of that's a metaphor for an entire community. Um, it the natural forces of a community's growth are probably those of the free market, and the natural forces of your garden's growth are those of nature, but they both need tending and management, or we have chaos.
Mhm.
And Esperanza, I think when Paul refers to things like tending and management, we could add to that mix political will as well
Yeah,
and
then
political courage.
that is exactly what I'm thinking. And I'm thinking about how in it, when you wrote the article just a couple of years prior, the planning board had been eliminated in the town of East Hampton. And when I learned about that, reading, I think it was with Deb Foster's book, because she was involved in getting
Yes.
back together, getting it all back together. And a lot of the preservation that we have today is due to that time, people's reaction to what was going on, probably in the late 70s. It's just astounding, though. I feel what I guess the point I'm making is I feel like a lot was done in those years. Your article, then there was the reaction, people coming back out and saying, no, we can't lose our community. And there was sort of a little bit of a preservation movement. I don't want to call it anti-development, but definitely more sort of conservation, preservation. And
Hmm.
then now we have been resting on those laurels for far too long. I mean, we're talking about 30, 40, almost 50 years down the road where things kind of, there were little checks and little changes, but not the massive, more looking at the planning side of things and saying, well, where are we going from
Yes. No,
here?
Esperanza, I agree completely. Let me say that there have been two important things that go hand in hand that have happened that have been positive that date from after this article. One is the whole farmland preservation program, in which the county now can buy farmland, buy development rights,
Development rights.
and therefore allow farmers to profit from the value of their land
Mm-hmm.
while still continuing to farm.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that's a tremendously creative and important and wise thing for the long-term benefit of the community. So too is the land transfer tax that goes into the Community Preservation Fund that has been used to buy land and keep it out of commercial development. Uh, those things, that too, we that idea was invented in Nantucket. We were much too slow to see how good it was and then copy it or create a version of it here.
Right.
But eventually we did, and it has been an enormously positive thing. But the other thing is the forces pushing in the other side just keep getting bigger and have more and more money behind them. And
Yeah.
so uh, those two tools have not saved this place that we all love so much. What they have done is prevent it from having gotten even worse in
Yeah.
these years.
Yes.
Yeah.
They've been one tool to push back, but it's not enough.
And one
But
more thing, because not only those two that you mentioned, but in those years, and even starting in the 50s, but more so in the 80s, a lot of the historic districts were created also.
Yes, yes,
And that has held,
right,
but again, the methodologies, you have one little historic district, but now they should be expanded, they should be revisited, and that has
right,
not happened.
right. And historic districts too need need management.
They need tending.
They need tending. Not only do they need to be cared for, but they need good management in terms of judgment because, uh, you know, beloved as East Hampton Village is, it is not a museum and should not be. It's a living, evolving place and needs to be open to some degree of change. And
Except no Belgian block, please.
right,
No more
right,
Belgian
right.
block.
We've had enough. I think we probably have more Belgian block than they have in Belgium.
Than in Belgium.
Right, I'm sure. I'm sure we do. And so uh, we 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 need to be more skillful in
Well,
managing
and that's what I
stuff.
mean is
Yes.
that tending that you refer to, that has to be, those historic districts when they occurred, it was a great idea. They had guidelines in place that were a good idea for the moment, but the methodologies changed, the way we see things change, and the evolution that you talk about needs to happen. And none of those guidelines, none of those historic districts have been revisited. And similarly, I think with the Community Preservation Fund, there are things that need to be tweaked constantly. It's like, let's look at this again.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Yep.
And then
Yeah.
also recognize that in a living place, uh, there is room for some degree of change. And there's also, I'm glad that East Hampton has a diversity of architectural styles. I would not want it to be colonial Williamsburg by the
Right.
sea, and any more than I want it to become Levittown by the sea.
Right.
Mhm.
So, I mean, it does have its own unique quality, and that unique quality is in very much due to both architectural and social diversity.
You know, Paul, and I'm so glad you mentioned things like the Community Preservation Fund, the farmland preservation. That was John V. N. Klein, his vision way back in the day. But
Yes,
and we're talking about things that were done, such as that. But in the article, you pointed out a few things that could be done, and now we're going to look at this 42 years later that haven't been. You mentioned in one place how other places limited building permits, the amount of building permits that could be issued per year. To the best of my knowledge, that's something that wasn't done
right,
here. But also,
right, right,
you
right.
quoted Peter Wolf, who wrote
Yes,
Land in America,
and
Its
right.
Value, Use, and Control. Esperanza, this was for me, I mean, this sounds positively brilliant. Um, Upzoning each piece of land by the same percentage. In other words, half acre goes to 3/4, 1 acre to 1.5 acres. And Paul, you ended your little summation of this by saying, but political courage is needed to be done.
Yes, yes.
So those are two things that have not been done here, to the
Right,
best,
right,
right?
right. Right. But now I also believe you're absolutely right. Those have not been done, although we have been doing some upzoning,
Right.
but uh, we certainly have never adopted that across the board system. I think for it to work, though, it also needs to be done in tandem with something else that we're doing a little bit of, but not enough, which is a system for affordable housing. Because of course, if we only upzone everything, it only makes an expensive place more
More
expensive.
expensive. Yes.
So, I mean, we talked earlier about Handy Lane in Amagansett. Um, for all the excessive density that there is to those, I forget, 6, 8, however many mini McMansions crammed onto these sites, had there been even greater density, but in the form of affordable housing there, I don't think anyone would have objected because it would have served a really valuable social objective
Mhm.
in terms of the betterment of the community.
Mhm.
And it was a site that actually probably would have been better suited to that than little mini estates that make
Mhm.
people try to pretend they're on further lane, but they're not.
Mhm.
And,
Mhm. Mhm.
and so uh, it would have been better for the community in all areas. But it would have also involved a willingness to have to either accept the density that has been created there now or have even greater density, but to a beneficial social purpose.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, reading that article, we're going to start to wrap up over the next couple of minutes, but
Mhm.
it was really interesting how at the very end of this article, and Esperanza, we could go on with Paul for hours, and I'm just going to interject when before this podcast airs. I tell everybody to read this article. I tell
Well, thank
everybody to
you.
go to the New
Thank
York
you.
Times
I,
website.
Erwin, I wish I got royalties from it.
Yeah, well, Paul made a remark, Esperanza. I know I'm digressing, but we do that on our Hamptons podcast. How at the event at the Jewish Center of the Hamptons, I actually posed the question to Paul, and he said, "Widely read, largely ignored." When he wrote that article, and I'm transporting yourself to that beach on Labor Day weekend, Esperanza, with everyone with the cover of the New York Times Magazine. Remember when we used to read paper newspapers? But anyway, you ended this article, Paul, talking about Flying Point Road in South
Yes.
in Watermill. Esperanza, we did a whole episode on Fort Dune, which adjoins this, if you recall. And so, Paul, this is almost poetic how we're going to sort of start to wrap up. This was an undeveloped, open piece of farmland on a very narrow peninsula, really, right?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And
Mm, not anymore. Right. Right. No,
I
not.
mean,
Um, well, Erwin, thank you. Thank you for helping assure that that article is not ignored.
no,
I, I very much appreciate that.
no, it's just so
Um,
prophetic in so many ways. And also just the quotes. I just want to close with this. You spoke about the Gwathmey house, how that was such an important,
yes.
house,
Yes.
but and we're going to let people read this article for themselves because we do want to let Paul go. But his writing here, Esperanza, but the new houses increasingly filling the farmland and beachfronts were abstractions, flamboyant shapes that had little to do with the mood of the land. Set chock a block against each other. 42 years later, we have Handy Lane. Okay. Paul saying
Exactly.
this in 1983. Set chock a block, fighting both the land and one another. And if they speak of any values, it's belligerence, not community. I mean, thematically, to close this, Esperanza and Paul, the more things change, the more they sort of stayed the
They
same.
certainly do. Yeah. Yeah. I keep wondering at times, and I was thinking about this leading up to our conversation today, is how will we be looking at the enormous white houses with black trim windows, 30 years from now?
Right. 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 Well,
Because we look at those, the cottages of the day of the 19th century and say, oh, this was the beginnings of the summer colony, the resort
yes.
community, and
Yes.
that hindsight and looking at it historically. And I keep thinking, how are we going to look at these monster houses?
Right.
Totally.
You know, part of the problem is we tend to cheapen things we admire by endless replication and duplication and often vulgarization as well. I mean, so many of the shingled houses that are going up now are based on this quite wonderful house in East Hampton, the Schuyler Quackenbush House by Cyrus Eidlitz, the architect, which is at the right at the beginning of Lee Avenue, where it meets Ocean. Uh, it's a fantastic house, one of the truly great ones. Also, until a few years ago, it was one of the only great early houses that was not surrounded by a hedge, and you could see it, which I wonder may have something to do with why it was so widely imitated. Everyone saw it, there it was. But then it all became just the object of like, cheap constant replication, all these houses by certain commercial builders and others that were just one after the other. Uh, and we're doing the same thing now with a new model, this so-called modern farmhouse. Uh, and the first few of them were kind of okay, and they seemed almost kind of refreshing. And then suddenly there it is everywhere, and it becomes, banal, annoying, and they also seem to get as with each generation, they get a little bit less good, you know, as if
Gaudier, yeah.
the genes are kind of weakening every time it gets copied, and so that's a problem. Uh, and then, of course, the modern houses, and some of the large modern houses going up today are very, very beautiful and done with enormous elegance and finesse. What they don't have is that kind of sense of fresh energy and modesty and simplicity that the earliest modern houses here from the 50s and 60s had, that were just these simple little, almost pavilion-like places by the sea. And the modern houses that are being built today are very often enormous, grand villas that are not in many ways different from the huge villas of 120 years ago. They just have modern architectural details on them instead. But they're every bit as much grand estates, you know, and so I sometimes
Versus just beach houses, which
Right.
is
versus
yeah,
just beach houses, exactly.
yeah.
So that, you know, if it has uh, a flat roof and a 30-foot expanse of glass, I don't know that it really is that different from if it has shingles and gables or if it has brick and Georgian architectural details and so forth. Um, they're all different forms of dress over the same kind of, they're different costumes that the same inside architecture is wearing,
Yeah.
which is that of a grandiose villa, really.
Wow.
Mhm. Mhm.
Paul, we could, I mean, Esperanza, we could, we didn't even delve into the loss of view sheds and everything else with Paul, which he actually,
We'll do that
we
another
have to
day,
do that
maybe.
another
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
But it was
There's going
just,
to be a part two,
that,
the hedging and
yeah,
screening of East
exactly,
Hampton.
Okay.
exactly. Paul
Well,
Goldberger,
that is a real issue too.
yeah,
Oh,
that,
yes.
And, you know, I used to say that one of my favorite things distinguishing East Hampton from Southampton was in Southampton everything was surrounded by hedges and private, whereas East Hampton you could ride around and see everything. It felt more democratic.
right,
Yes.
There's one of the biggest differences between then and now, which is that that aspect of Southampton has come here.
yeah,
It's creeped. Yep.
no question.
There's a lot of creeping going
Wow.
on.
Paul Goldberger, really,
So
thank you
much
so
fun.
much
Well,
for
Yeah.
sharing with
thank
us.
you
It
both.
was
It's really
fantastic.
fun. It's fun to be here and fun to talk with both of you.
Well, thanks
Thank
so much
you.
for being
Thank
our
you.
guest.
Okay.
Esperanza, as always, a pleasure.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
having me.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
being
Paul.
here.
Right.
Thanks so much for joining us. New episodes of Our Hamptons are released every other Tuesday. Find them wherever you get your podcasts.